He had forgotten what kindness felt like. She had forgotten how to hope. One simple dinner invitation saved them both.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The town of Copper Springs had known Elijah Crane for 7 years, and in all that time not a single soul had asked him to sit at their table. He was the man who fixed fences when storms tore them down. He was the man who broke wild horses that other cowboys feared to touch. He was the man who rode into town once a month for supplies, speaking only the words necessary to complete his transactions before disappearing back into the dust from which he came. Nobody knew where he had come from. Nobody knew why his eyes carried such weight, like stones sinking in deep water. They only knew that Elijah Crane was not the kind of man you invited into your home. He had accepted this truth long ago, the way a man accepts the color of his own eyes or the particular loneliness of his own shadow. Some men were meant for family suppers and Christmas gatherings and the warmth of candlelit conversations. Elijah was meant for cold campfires and the company of stars that never answered back. On the evening, everything changed. He had ridden into town with autumn in the air and a chill settling into his bones that felt older than his 32 years. The general store was nearly empty when he entered, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his hat pulled low against curious glances that never came anymore. People had long stopped being curious about Elijah Crane. He was simply part of the landscape now, like a weathered barn or a crooked fence post. He was reaching for a tin of coffee beans when he heard her voice. "You dropped this, mister." Elijah turned slowly, the way a man does when he has forgotten what it feels like to be spoken to directly. She was standing there with her hand extended, holding a worn leather glove that must have slipped from his coat pocket. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and there was something in her face that he had not seen directed at him in years. Genuine kindness without expectation, without fear. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She smiled, and something cracked inside his chest like ice breaking on a spring river. "I'm Clara," she said. "Clara Whitmore. I took over the boarding house from old Mrs. Patterson last month. You must be the horse gentler everyone talks about." Everyone talks about. The words sat strange in his ears. He wondered what they said, that he was dangerous, peculiar, a man best avoided. "Elijah Crane," he offered, taking the glove from her hand. Their fingers brushed, and he felt the contact move through him like lightning seeking ground. "I know who you are," Clara said, and her smile did not falter. "I've been hoping to meet you. The way people describe your work with horses, it sounds almost like magic." "Just patience," he said. "Animals trust patience. People should too," she replied. And there was something meaningful in the way she said it, something that suggested she saw more than his weathered exterior and silence. She was perhaps 28, with auburn hair pinned loosely at her neck and hands that showed evidence of hard work. There was a strength in her stance, a determination in her shoulders, but also a softness around her eyes that spoke of sorrow survived. "Mr. Crane," she said, and he felt the formality of his name like a small disappointment. "I make supper every evening at the boarding house. There's always more than enough. Would you like to come tonight? 6 o'clock. The invitation hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Nobody had ever asked Elijah Crane to dinner. He should have said no. He should have tipped his hat and walked away and returned to the safety of his solitary cabin where expectations could not wound him and hope could not take root. But something in her honey-colored eyes held him in place, and before his better judgment could intervene, he heard himself say, "I would like that." The walk to Clara's boarding house that evening was the longest of his life. He had changed into his cleanest shirt, a blue cotton that still held the memory of better days. He had combed his dark hair and trimmed his beard, and looked at himself in the cracked mirror of his cabin, searching for whatever flaw had kept him outside the circles of human warmth for so many years. He saw only a man, tired, perhaps, and marked by seasons of solitude, but just a man nonetheless. The boarding house glowed with lamplight when he arrived. Through the windows he could see the shapes of people moving, and he nearly turned back 3 times before his knuckles found the courage to knock. Clara answered the door herself, and her face brightened in a way that made his heart forget its familiar rhythm. "You came," she said, as if she had genuinely wondered whether he would. "Said I would," he replied. She led him inside, into a parlor warm with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. There were others there, a young couple traveling west, an older gentleman with spectacles and kind eyes, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who nodded politely in his direction. Elijah felt their gazes land upon him and prepared himself for the usual discomfort, the subtle shifting away. But Clara introduced him simply as Mr. Crane, the finest horse gentler in the territory, and something in her voice commanded respect. The others smiled and made room at the table, and for the first time in memory, Elijah sat among strangers who did not treat him like a stranger. Dinner was simple but prepared with care. Roasted chicken, potatoes swimming in butter, green beans from the last of the autumn garden. Elijah had not eaten food made by another person's hands in so long that the first bite nearly undid him. He had to pause, set down his fork and steady himself against the emotion that rose unexpected and unwelcome in his chest. "Mr. Crane?" Clara's voice was soft with concern. "Is something wrong?" "No," he managed. "It's been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal is all. Forgot how good it could be." The table fell quiet, but it was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of recognition, of understanding that sometimes a simple kindness could touch places that had been left untended too long. After dinner, the others retired to their rooms, and Elijah found himself helping Clara wash dishes in the small kitchen behind the dining room. He dried while she washed, and they worked in a comfortable silence that felt like a conversation anyway. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said finally, her hands still in the soapy water. "You can ask. Why do you live out there all alone? A man with your skills, your way with animals, you could work anywhere. You could have friends, a family." Elijah set down the plate he was drying and looked at her. In the lamplight, her face was open and earnest, and he realized that she genuinely wanted to know. She was not asking to satisfy curiosity or confirm rumors. She was asking because she cared. "I did something," he said slowly, the words coming from a place he had kept locked for years. "A long time ago, before I came here. Something I couldn't undo. I thought staying away from people was the penance I deserved." Clara turned from the basin, drying her hands on her apron. "On. What did you do?" He hesitated. The truth lived in him like a stone, heavy and ever-present. "I was a deputy in a town called Red Mesa. There was a man. Everyone believed he had killed a farmer over a land dispute. The evidence pointed to him. I was part of the posse that brought him in." Elijah's voice tightened. "He hanged for it. And 6 months later, they found the real killer. The man we hanged was innocent. He had a wife, children." The words hung in the air between them, naked and terrible. "I resigned. Couldn't wear the badge anymore. Couldn't look at myself. I thought if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand, a gesture so simple and so startling that he felt his breath catch. "You didn't kill that man," she said. "A broken system did. Incomplete evidence did. Human error did. You were part of something tragic, but that tragedy doesn't define who you are. Tell that to his children," Elijah said bitterly. "I'm telling it to you," Clara replied, and her grip on his hand tightened. "Because you've been punishing yourself for 7 years, and I suspect you've never once allowed yourself to believe you might deserve forgiveness." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw in her eyes a pain that mirrored his own, different in its details, but equal in its weight. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Clara released his hand and turned back to the dishes. but not before he saw the shadow that crossed her face. My husband died 3 years ago. Fever took him in 2 weeks. We had been married for only a year. I blamed myself for a long time. Thought maybe if I had called the doctor sooner, if I had prayed harder, if I had been a better wife. She shook her head. I carried that guilt like a millstone until it nearly drowned me. What changed? She looked at him over her shoulder. I realized that guilt was keeping me from living. It wasn't honoring his memory, it was destroying mine. He would have hated to see me wasting away in grief. So I sold everything, came west, bought this boarding house. I decided to start feeding people, nurturing them. It felt like a way to give life instead of dwelling in death. Elijah understood then why she had invited him to dinner. She had looked at him and seen a fellow survivor, someone trapped in the amber of their own regret, frozen in a moment that would never let them go. "You saw me," he said. "I saw someone who needed to be reminded that they still existed," Clara replied, "that they still mattered." He came to dinner again the following week, and the week after that. By the 3rd week, Clara had stopped calling him Mr. Crane and started calling him Elijah, and the sound of his name in her voice became a kind of music he had not known he was missing. They talked in the kitchen after the other guests had gone to bed. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her mother's apple orchard and her father's gentle hands. He told her about learning to gentle horses from an old Cherokee man who believed that every creature deserved respect, even the ones that kicked and bit. They shared their griefs and their small joys, their fears and their tentative hopes, building something between them brick by careful brick. On a cold November evening, Elijah arrived at the boarding house to find Clara alone. The traveling couple had moved on. The old gentleman had gone to visit family. Mrs. Henderson was visiting a sister in the next town. "Just us tonight," Clara said, and there was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability, an expectation that made his heart race. They ate by candlelight, the food growing cold as their conversation grew warm. She asked him about his childhood, and he found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, about his mother dying when he was young, about his father's silence that had taught him to be silent too, about the lonely years when he had wandered from town to town searching for a place to belong. "You belong here," Clara said softly. "You belong at this table, with me." The words struck him like a physical force. He set down his fork and looked at her across the candlelight, and in her face he saw everything he had denied himself for 7 long years: connection, acceptance, love. "Clara," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I'm not a whole man. I'm broken in ways that might never heal. Then we'll be broken together," she replied. "My pieces and yours. Maybe they'll fit in ways we can't predict." He rose from the table and moved to her side, dropping to one knee so that their eyes were level. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered cheek, and he felt something inside him finally begin to let go. "I don't know how to love properly anymore," he confessed. "I've been alone so long that I've forgotten how to let someone in." "Then we'll learn together," Clara said. "One dinner at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time." He leaned forward and kissed her, softly at first. Then with 7 years of loneliness pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. She kissed him back, her hands in his hair, her tears mingling with his own. And in that moment the walls he had built around his heart crumbled into dust. That winter was the warmest of Elijah's life. He still worked the ranches, still gentled horses that others feared to touch, but now there was a reason to come home. Clara's boarding house became his harbor, her kitchen his sanctuary, her arms his refuge from the cold. The townspeople noticed the change in him. He smiled now, nodded at people on the street, even stopped to chat occasionally. The mysterious cowboy was becoming simply Elijah, Clara's Elijah, and the transformation rippled outward like circles in still water. By spring, he had moved his few possessions into a room at the boarding house. B was summer. He had asked her to marry him, kneeling in the kitchen where she had first taken his hand and told him he deserved forgiveness. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Elijah, 1,000 times yes. They married in September, in the small church at the edge of town, with a whole community in attendance. People who had avoided Elijah for 7 years now shook his hand and congratulated him, and he realized that the wall between himself and others had never been their doing. It had been his own, built from guilt and sustained by fear. On their wedding night, Clara led him to the room they would share and turned to face him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You saved me," she said. "You know that, don't you?" "I think we saved each other," he replied. She smiled, that same smile that had first cracked the ice around his heart in the general store a year ago. "I looked at you that day, and I saw someone worth knowing. Someone worth loving. I am so glad I trusted that feeling." "I am so glad you invited me to dinner," Elijah said. "No one had ever done that before." "Then everyone else was foolish," Clara replied, "because you were the best meal guest I ever had." He laughed, a sound that had once felt foreign to him, but now came easily, naturally, like breathing. He gathered her in his arms and held her close, feeling her heartbeat against his own, feeling the rightness of her presence like sunshine after a long winter. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars he had spent so many years talking to in his loneliness. But now he had someone who answered back, someone who listened, someone who looked at him and saw not the sum of his mistakes but the whole of his potential. Elijah Crane had spent 7 years believing he deserved solitude, but in the end, all it took was one invitation, one dinner, one woman brave enough to see beyond his silence and into his soul.